I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Virginella very much for the invitation to be here and congratulating her, in fact, on the ERC Advanced. This is a huge grant, and it really is the one that everybody wants, isn't it? And so, and also not just the grant, but the topic, which is fantastic. And I'm looking forward to keeping up with all the outputs that come out of your team's work over the next 5 years. So thank you for the invitation and congratulations. In hvala za povabilo, bom samo tu po slovensko povedala, da zdaj se spomnim, da mislim, da je 30 let, ko sem prvič bila v Ljubljani na poletna šola, da sem se učila slovensko in malo sem se učila, drugače, boljše, če predavam po angliško zdaj. Okay, hvala lepo. So, I just get my notes ready. How's the sound? Is it better if I just talk outside of the microphone? Better in front? Directly in the mic? Okay. It's a little bit like being in church, the priest. Okay. In a moment. Okay. Oops. So can we have my one? Just before, I'll start talking and explaining a little bit about my paper. I think, listening to Martin explain the project. What I'm struck by is what happens when you shift thinking about gender from the national or even a regional plane and from social history to a kind of more abstract international plane, where you're thinking about concepts and international law. And what I'd like to do is take up in the discussions today just where those points of connection are between kind of international and national planes of study, but also thinking about the intersections between these different historiographical approaches as well, the different methods. So the paper I'm going to speak from today reflects my general fascination with the shaping of international orders, with these post-war transition moments, which I think are interesting, partly because of the displacement that's going on, but also because they tend to give us a window into a wider spectrum of political thinking at a particular moment. The paper that I'm speaking to today was conceived as a way of studying and thinking about gender in the context of a longer modern history of post-war orders. So from 1814 and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which is a period I'm just writing about at the moment, until the 1970s. And what I think of as another kind of post-war order, the new international economic order. I find these historical moments useful as sites from which to observe the making or inventing of politics. And because of my particular archival bias as politics from a European perspective. But that said, I'm also aware, having looked at the papers today and looking forward to hearing them, just where different parts of Europe sit vis-a-vis the kinds of developments I'm going to speak about today. So I want to look at the fate of gender from 1814 until the 1970s, and with a particular interest in the economic dimensions of the shaping of international orders. So Marta just said, your ERC has less focus on the political because it has been talked about a lot. My interest is in the economic as a realm that is politicised through the modern period of international political history. So I have questions about, as I said, how this international history maps onto your specific interests, including whether or not the international is a significant context of the ideas and practices in which the national histories we are discussing over the next 2 days are embedded. Do they notice each other? Indeed, when it comes to the history of human rights, how do national and international histories connect? Does a focus on international political exchanges expose the absence of a more granulated national experience? Where is the nation state in international history? And I think I have some answers to these questions, and we may want to save them for the discussion. So right now I want to launch into my chronology, working my way backwards and then forwards through a longer history of the intersections of gender observed through the specific idea of family, human rights, and international politics in the longue durée. My moments are, let's see if this works, the end of the Second World War, which is of most interest to you, the end of the First World War, and the end of the Napoleonic Wars. We have the UN system, the League of Nations system, and the invention of international politics through a Eurocentric multilateralism in these three moments. Each of these moments of multilateral peacemaking occurred at the end of major total wars, and they have in common human rights and international elements. And I put family rather than gender at the centre, partly because I wrote the paper in discussions with Julia Moses, who's at Sheffield, for a project she's working on in regard to the latter part of the 19th century. And if I'm not giving away too much, I want to reveal now the end of the story, which is that family becomes a more obvious concern in the international domain only in the 20th century, in the kinds of private concerns of citizenship and marriage, and in relation to the economic system that gets discussed and negotiated in these international contexts at the end of wars. Although human rights and international politics have this economic aspect through this period from 1814 until the 1970s, family does become important, is important all the way through, but only becomes a part of the international realm of politics in the latter part of the 19th century. And I probably don't need to convince any of you that gender and nation are crucial framings for each of these themes and their connections, in the sense that the idea of family through the 19th and 20th centuries is mutually entangled in the history of shifting gender norms and politics. So regardless of whether we think of an international, European, or other larger than national context. So in the classic text is Naira Yuval Davis, who argued that gender relations are perceived to be at the heart of the discourse on nations and nationalism, and that nations have been imagined as natural extensions of the family and kinship relations in nationalist rhetorics. The pertinent point is that over the last 200 years and more, the expansion of an international political sphere, filled out with international law and international institutions, and driven by the principle of multilateralisms to the ends of peace, burgeoned alongside the rise of the same bourgeoisie and national state forms that have been the more comfortable context for studying the changing concept of family and its public political significance. So as we'll see, by the 20th century, as really existing international institutions and practices comprised mutually reinforcing national and internationalist ambitions, they shared political metaphors and imaginaries, imagined not only as the expanded national, human, international family, but also implicating the family in new internationally sanctioned gender norms of labour, nowhere more obvious than in the internationalised iconographies of industrialisation, and I'll come back to those at the end. So these are points that arise almost without prompting, and if we consider, for example, the most emblematic of human rights documents, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, despite its emphasis on the individual, declared the rights of all members of the human family, to the extent that it has been argued that the drafters presented the nuclear family as the civilised endpoint of social evolution and as a model for the world. Now, this history is interesting or important, but only if we think about it as more than just that metaphor. Instead, as we know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had more than one drafter. It constituted only one of the international sites that tied rights, the family, and the world together. It was also, even though Russia, of course, was involved in its drafting, Russia and Yugoslavia and 6 other states abstained from passing it, of course. But it was the product of a range of political and economic, even national ambitions, and it would be taken up in ways that could not have been predicted by its drafters. So I'm going to launch now into this history of how human rights and internationalism leads us to the family, how the family leads us back to gender, and to the economics of gendered norms and policies in the international domain, and possibly to the history of capitalism, and then raising the question, where does this history actually belong, this history of post-wars? So I'm starting in the middle of the 20th century because I actually wanted to think about a structure and to think about how the 20th century and the 19th century pan out once we start looking in the long term. So to the critical moment, if we're thinking about human rights, the mid-20th century, reinvention of international order in the wake of the Second World War, with its explicit emphasis on human rights as a guiding principle, and the debates around a human rights bill, which eventually became a declaration on human rights as the rights of all members of the human family. And we can imagine then all those other actors that you're studying in the Northeast Adriatic, thinking about post-war orders and gender and women's rights, where are they positioned vis-a-vis what I'm going to talk about today? Because that's what I've started thinking about. The centrality of family was not simply the provenance of metaphor. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, famously revealed the gendered social vision imagined in terms of a normative modern family unity made up of breadwinner and housewife and underpinning the Declaration's social and economic rights. As importantly for my argument, it reinforced the reality that the economy was not an autonomous realm divorced from the gendered and racial regimes in which labour was ordered and wealth accumulated and handed down from one generation to the next. The intrinsic subject of social welfare and the right to work was represented as a masculine subject, or put another way, delegates that were drafting and considering this declaration overwhelmingly shared a commitment to the family as the primary site of welfare and social reproduction. In this sense, it has been argued that Soviet delegates, as much as Western, assumed the state's job was to protect the home. And of course, the abstention then raises the question, what were their issues, and were they around the gender norms embedded in this declaration? And I think there may be work on this, I just don't know it in terms of the Yugoslav case. Certainly not delineated in any of the major histories of the drafting that I've read. The history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its drafters gives us a sense of a broader spectrum of how invocations of the family revolved around the negotiation of women's status. That is, women's economic and political rights were equally hostage to, or at least in tension with, the status of family and their gendered role according to familial norms. Now, one of the most famous figures in this history is often René Cassin, a French jurist who always talked of himself as the father of human rights and actually got a Nobel Peace Prize because of his role on the drafting commission. In his view, and Cassin really wasn't, you can't call him sort of on the right. He was very much in part of the milieu of French feminism in the interwar, for example. It was Cassin who emphasised the universal rather than international aspect of human rights and invoked the equality of humans as the members of one human family. He didn't always think that that was true in the colonies, but Cassin tended to agree with his peers in his emphasis on the family as a fundamental and foundational unit of human existence, and his view, consistent with his early 20th century discussions of women's rights, that women and men should have equal rights, although some rights needed adapting to their specific gendered contributions to society through their family roles. It's always the family then that interrupts this equality. There's other examples. There's Charles Malik on the drafting committee, who was a Lebanese Christian, who argued the Christian derivation of human rights from Holy Scripture, but he, like the Jewish Cassin, embedded the rights and liberties of individuals in social groups and bonds such as family, household, vocation, city and nation. There were women on the drafting committee. They were feminists, each in different ways. Not only the wife of the American president, Sir Eleanor Roosevelt, but also the Indian delegate Hansa Mehta, who demanded that the interests, Mechta, demanded that the interests of children and mothers be separated, so the family model gets taken out of these gender norms, in order to emphasise women's intrinsic rights as individuals. Throughout, she put this emphasis on individuals, and she also differed from Roosevelt in that she belonged to a cohort of feminists who believed that because of the way in which women were being ignored in the debate on human rights, there needed to be a separate body. This became the Commission on the Status of Women, which took up questions such as the rights of women within families, equality in marriage, monogamy, nationality. This is a big issue because of the nationality of married women within families. How could women have their own nationality if they were part of a family unit and the children had to have one nationality? Property rights, guardianship of children, social and economic equality, the prevention of traffic in women, and equal opportunity in the domain of education. At the same time, it's been argued that these women too accepted the idea of a familial model of welfare when it came to economic questions, that gender norms and the male breadwinner model couldn't really be tangled with that much. Now, the final version of the 1948 Declaration on Human Rights, what didn't women get? Well, they didn't get the separation of women's rights from children's rights. Instead, the Declaration enshrined the family as the natural, and this is from it, the natural and fundamental group unit of society, entitled to protection by society and the state. It embedded familiar gender conventions rather than disambiguating women's rights as humans from related familial norms. And this had significant legal and economic implications for women. And I'll return to that later. What I'm going to do now is go back in time a bit more. I'm going back to the end of the First World War. So we've got the centenary coming up next year. And I think it would be really interesting in a way to put some of the questions of your group into this history of the making of an international order at the end of the First World War, in terms of a kind of more social history in parts of Europe that aren't usually incorporated into that history. But when we look more generally at the international context of this history, we find that there are lots of similarities between the international order view of the Declaration of 48 and the League of Nations moment of 1919. And Deborah Stienstra, for example, has argued that the UN was modelled on the practice of gender relations embedded in the League of Nations. When we turn to the League, we find out, as Carol Miller, one of the earliest historians of women in Geneva, warned, that whenever the themes of women and international affairs or women were raised for discussion, there was brought into play an elaborate set of assumptions about the category of women. These rehearsed the foundational status of the family. Now, I do know that I've read some of and sort of tried to recover some of the Austrian history of this. So we know that there are lots of connections between feminist movements on the ground in the post-war Austrian Republic and the League of Nations, trying to make connections, particularly in the economic sphere. If you think of the cooperative movement that Emmy Freundlich sets up, what I don't know is what's happening in the Northeast Adriatic. And I think that would be a really rich area of exploration. So we need look no further, I think, than the International Labour Organization, the ILO, an institution created a century ago as part of the League of Nations system, and often credited with the promotion of a family-based welfare system and with the drafting of Article 25 of the Declaration of 1948. So we have this link between the ILO and the UDHR through the idea of labour rights and labour law on an international level. Russia doesn't... a lot of this is framed in opposition to the Bolshevik Revolution, but in fact Russia joins the ILO, I think, in 1934. And I was trying to find out when the Kingdom of Yugoslavia joins, but I think also in the 1930s. The ILO returns us to the significance of the economic strand of rights in thinking about the international order at that time. Written into the ILO's constitution was the rhetoric of sentiments of justice and humanity and social justice on the grounds that conditions of labour exist involving such injustice, hardship and privation to large numbers of people, and that this injustice imperiled the harmony of the world. So there's a question of economic security being placed at the heart of this reinventing of the international order. So where are women going to sit in this view of the post-war order? Well, that is partly decided by the creation of the ILO in opposition to the Bolshevik Revolution as an alternative for workers. They don't have to go looking to Moscow for an alternative site of labour rights. They're going to get it now, that's the rhetoric, through the ILO, the International Labour Organization. Some drafters of the ILO Charter presume that if only some countries introduce social reform, this might make them uncompetitive with those that did not. So they didn't only think about sentiments of justice and humanity, they thought, actually, but if we're forced to have social reform and like better wages for workers and better conditions, what about if somewhere else doesn't have it? Then they're going to get all the business and we're not. So we better make sure it's international and universal. So one of the motivations for the universalism of labour rights in 1919 is precisely this argument about equal playing field economically, rather than a kind of human rights idea of the role of labour law. So in practice, these rationales added up to a series of ILO social insurance conventions passed over 10 years for accidents, sickness, old age, invalidity, widowhood, maternity and orphans that required, it was said, effective protection of the workers against risks endangering their livelihood or that of their families. In the hands of the ILO, these precedents became critical to efforts through the 1920s to integrate family allowances and breadwinners' wages into the compilation of the idea of standards of living. So you have embedded in the promotion of standards of living a male breadwinner, a family model. So just to simply say, there are two themes that come out of this. One is labour and economics as a primary context for the family in this earlier period, relative to cultural differences. So if you're from non-European empires, and actually I don't know what happens if you're from other empires, but non-European ones, then you might be regarded as having different cultural or even physiological reasons for not fitting this model. And so the children, Indian children on this argument mature earlier, so they have different kinds of families, therefore they don't need to be protected in the same way. So there are those kinds of caveats. The second point is that family also is embedded in the citizenship rights implied in the two principles of the post-war peace, of the 1919 peace. So one of those was national self-determination, or the principle of nationality. And that became a problem for women, we know, because of the family model. So one of the big struggles in the interwar was the right of married women to nationality. And the second question was more fundamentally women's rights and which sphere it belonged to. And because of the family, partly because of that family contextualisation, when women approached the peacemakers in 1919, and they did as delegations, with very well-networked delegations of middle-class women, and said, we want the same rights to self-determination as nations, the peacemakers, who included, the Maharaja of Bikaner, the Italian representatives, the Chinese, the Japanese, as well as the British and the Americans and the Australians and New Zealanders, all said unanimously, no, because the status of women is a national question. It determines the sovereignty of the nation. If the nation can't determine the sovereignty of its women in relationship to these family questions, then it has no sovereignty, it has no way of defining its difference. So women and gender were very problematic in the international space. So you can see how interesting it is then to track through to the 1970s, when some of that becomes much more easier to tackle in the international space. But before then, it really is that question of the nation defines itself around these issues, so how can they be relevant in international context? So I think it's probably clear by now that internationalism and human rights, and internationalism being these kind of international political spheres, were entangled with economic questions that were inevitably gendered, caught up in the contestation and reproduction of bourgeois family norms, possibly even in socialist contexts, that were critical to the moral and socio-economic formation of national states, even as the national state was only on the cusp of its legitimacy as a critical foundational principle of 20th century liberal internationalism. So the nation state in 1919 is still a norm, but not particularly normal. So this brings me to 1814, just because I'm writing on it at the moment. And, you know, we're in Ljubljana, Congress of Laibach as well as Vienna. That's one image of it. That's another. Lots of men sitting around making decisions. What's interesting for me is that the decisions they're making are about the human rights and international part of this story. There are three themes that become important in the context of the peacemaking in 1814 from Vienna onwards through Laibach and to Verona: abolition of the slave trade, Jewish rights, and national independence, and becomes Greek independence. So I recently wrote something in the American Historical Review that tries to bring these together. But thinking about it in terms of gender, what I find striking, again, this is an area I think somebody has to investigate, is that it's clear that these issues are on the table because of the Napoleonic Civil Code. So the piece is about what do you do with the post-Napoleonic order, where Jews have rights and then people want to take them away, or where questions of national independence have already been put on the table, or where, in fact, slavery is, well, it's a British agenda, but where does the slave trade fit in the context of this new post-war order? But the one thing that they don't discuss openly, and I find it quite interesting, is the Napoleonic Civil Code's precepts for the status of women and men and family. So it's very clear in the code that that men are the leaders of families, and there are all sorts of specifications about the right of deciding the inheritance of children, but also that women, for example, can't trade. Women aren't allowed to be economically active unless they have the permission of their husband. So I find these really interesting aspects of that code that then what happens to them? Because everything else about the code is being discussed and debated, but not this. And there's a way in which it's almost normatively included in this kind of the unfolding new post-Napoleonic era of bourgeois nation-state norms. So if someone can tell me there's a debate about those issues somewhere, given that the French Revolution did discuss women's rights, I'd love to find it, because I do think it's rather interesting silence in the documents that I've seen. So there is family in 1814 in other ways, and that is in terms of dynastic rights, the fraternity of the Republic, bourgeois national values across humanitarianism and international finance. This couple are sort of typify these bourgeois family values, and their engagement with multilateralism and international politics is all about melding these worlds in a way. Anyway, that's a bigger issue. So where we come to then, by looking backwards over 150 years, is to this kind of interesting way in which one can mark out or demarcate when gender and family become acknowledged international problems, and also the extent to which family is a key structural framing influencing what problems become international, and that the economic dimensions of family and gender norms are determinative in specific ways of the kinds of rights that women can demand in this period. So let me then go forward and try to kind of bring this round. So if gender and family norms were not embedded in international or universalist conventions of 1814, we can't assume that 1919 was when these ideas first began to intersect family/gender, human rights, internationalism. Instead, we find, in fact, that if you go back from 1919, between 1919 and 1814, we have, of course, the late 19th century intergovernmental forums discussing labour rights, and specifically often whether regulations should be placed on women's labour at night or in certain kinds of conditions because of their roles as mothers. We also find then, if you go back even further, there's the rise of international labour law that also is considering these issues. And in the 1840s, so around the same time as we're getting a much stronger sense of the nation-state in political discussions in this international sphere, the thinking about the role of family becomes very prominent. And here my example is from Daniel Legrand, the last example in that slide, who in the 1840s, as a Swiss industrialist, he made ribbons, argued that an international labour law was the only possible solution to the great social problem of granting moral and material well-being to the working class. So from his perspective, this was for two reasons. One was if you had any kind of labour reform, again, the economic level playing field, it's better to have it everywhere, not just in one place, so that there's equal competition. But secondly, because he said it had to prevent the destruction of the family. The festering wound of modern industry was undermining the family, and international labour law was all about restoring family life as one of the greatest benefits procurable for the working classes. So what you have here is a history of the welfare state in the international domain. So a century after Legrand's proposal, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights restated the specific economics of family norms in the realm of international labour arrangements. So you have that continuity through the 19th and 20th centuries. The images of economic security that the ILO had inspired and the Universal Declaration embedded were imbued with the family imaginaries that had become critical to a moral view of labour and the dignity of labour, intensified by the ideological competition of the Cold War. So what's interesting to me then is we have then a picture of these rather conservative, from our, I presume, well, at least a restricted notion of women's rights embedded in gender norms, embedded in family. Let's say a restricted notion of it, but kind of universally shared. Yet once one starts to look a bit closer, you realise that there is a spectrum of thinking on the value of this, of the UDHR and even the ILO in the context of a contestation over meanings of family, particularly in the post-Second World War period. So there's a spectrum of thinking and interpretation of these documents and what they offer. Now here it's helpful to consider, I think, a woman I find quite interesting, the Swedish feminist Alva Myrdal. She worked in the Human Rights Commission as its acting head in 1949, so the year after the declaration was signed. And then as head of social sciences at UNESCO until the mid-1950s, as these debates about human rights and women's rights swirled around her in the international domain. And she wrote in 1948, in the context of the Universal Declaration, that it's for me a great pleasure to think that social democratic women now gain an unhindered opportunity to speak to and gain influence over the UN. What this women's group supports and wants is of such central importance to shaping the modern welfare state that a key post in the UN Social Department will allow this group the best chance to alter human society in line with its views. So the context of the Commission on the Status of Women, for example, and her own role in the UN are going to give the opportunity to actually put forward a modern welfare state template outside of Sweden and across, for her, in her view, across much of the post-colonial world, and that's her interest. So for Myrdal, it's clear that the family model, entrenched in the Universal Declaration, couldn't cloud a vision of the Declaration as the radical fringe of social democracy. It's easier to see her vision when we listen to Christian Democrats who believe that Myrdal did indeed represent a shift in perspective at the UN. That meant that internationalism newly posed a threat to the family. So from the perspective of these Christian Democrats, in the post-war, Christian democracy had been able to take root in new states and to influence the UN's declaration most of its work on social policy and human rights, until the UN became the voice of women such as Myrdal, for whom he alleged there were no moral absolutes, for whom he alleged the traditional 19th century family was pathological, rootless, isolated and doomed, and who wanted a new family model of women and men as comrades in outside labour, children as a social governmental responsibility. So for him, this now represented the threat to family, this document that we understand as embedding family. And I think this is the other interesting aspect of these documents, and again, an aspect that might be taken up in the context of a social history of the post-war, is how they're taken on board, not just how they're influenced or how people, if they notice them or think of them as useful, but actually how they're then taken up in local contexts, in local politics. It's true that for a long time in the context of pre-war and wartime Europe, Myrdal's focus was on population planning as an instrument of women's rights. So this was the other aspect that the Christian Democrats didn't like, that by the late 1940s and early 50s, that family planning, that meant women's rights, reproductive rights, which allowed, in Myrdal's mind, them to go off and have work and to escape the family model, were intrinsic to the kinds of human rights that the UN was promoting. And in fact, by 1968, the year of the Tehran International Conference on Human Rights, women's right to control her own fertility and to realise her other human rights, such as education and training and economic rights, is made a part of that conference sort of statement. So I want to wrap up now and just try to come to some overview of what I've laid out here. If you pull a thread, you're immediately confronted with snarls, entanglements in this history of family, gender, human rights, international politics. I should have just taken one thing. Anyway, family is never separate from the status of women and the status of men, just as the status of women is rarely separated from the normative idea of family. In these scenarios, family, gender, women, men are all tied up in the fate of the narratives of nations, or more materially even, the reproduction of nations, although to what extent is the question. At stake, too, are the constitutive ideological foundations of those nations, often identified with religious norms. 1814 then sits early in the bourgeoisification of politics, although bourgeois norms were already crucial to the way in which contemporaries viewed and interpreted politics, even in a transnational, international sphere. But how did socialist states take these ideas up? I think that's one of the really interesting aspects of this story, and the extent to which there are intersections and overlaps. We can say the seeds of human rights were planted at that time in the articulation of Jewish rights in 1814, anti-slavery and national independence as human rights causes, each of which were justified on economic grounds. When you look at them closely, that's the justification. And delineated then the liberal internationalist character of the new international order and then its remaking in 1919 and 1945. By 1919, in a context in which international actors self-consciously imagined themselves as the inheritors of 1814, family was intrinsic to the forms of international order fashioned out of the rubble of war. In particular, we can see the influence of a normative bourgeois gendered idea of the family inscribed into the economic security considered a necessary extension of internationalist objectives, such as peace. By the time we get to the end of the Second World War and the elevation of human rights as a principle, family remained integral to the imagining of an international community and the possibility of internationalising human rights, even as the individual was privileged, and feminists of a number of kinds engaged these fora to press for economic and political equality. What are the implications then? By the 80s, you actually have a document called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which actually takes out the family from the articulation of women's rights. But it's a long time, it's the 1980s before that happens. So we can say then, I think, that this longue durée view reveals the extent to which the politics of economics were influenced and even fashioned in the international realm, including internationalist thinking that constituted that realm. That's my first point. I think I have 5. Second, the impact of changing national politics and ambitions in that same international realm is, I think, open for further study at a social history level. Thirdly, the enduring entanglement of women's rights with the normative family in this same national, international, economic, political frame. I think you can make the statement that that's true, but on the other hand, again, are there differences between how this is taken up nationally and internationally in the same kind of synchronic moment? Fourthly, we can talk about the unpredictable position of feminists and internationalists in this history and how they take up these documents, even when we see them as embedding these conservative ideas. So I'm looking forward to talking to you more about where nations fit into this, but I would return to my initial emphasis on the economic stakes of these questions, of human rights questions, as part of these intersecting histories and transnational normative national political cultures. So I think it's really important that as we look at the political, we rethink the place of the economic in the constitution of political cultures, whether it's national or international. In the 19th and 20th centuries, humanity and rights norms and discourses were the product of economic as well as political and legal actors and ideas. There were diverse economic episodes and implications, sometimes leading us in the direction of the idealisation of the market, at others of the ideas of economic and social justice and individual rights. This international framing raises more questions, including where should we look for a history of family and human rights? The international is not more than the national. It is, I would argue, another space in which nation-states agree a transnational consensus on major ideological socio-economic bases of modern political life, usually around the status of women and their own rights. Thank you. These are my pictures. Shall I just show you these? So these are from, has anyone been to the old ILO building in Geneva, which is now the World Trade Organization, right? So it has these murals. So if you want a history of neoliberalism, 1970s, I think the ILO had to move out and the World Trade Organization moved in, and it then hid all these images. It either curtained them or put walls in front of them, and recently they've been recovered. And they are very much of the period, and we can see, they're very gendered. It's about industry, industrialisation. Some are quite American. These, for example, and you've got the mother and the child over there, and modern industry, that's an American depiction. The same guy that did the murals inside the Empire State Building, yeah. And then, but in this one, the women are at the sewing machines, so they're part of industry. And then we have the metaphorical, gender thing. Oh, that's Elvis. Sorry, I should have put that up earlier, but I'll show you. This is the first one that was put up in the ILO halls, and of course it's religious. There's a kind of, nostalgic view of agricultural labour and Jesus all together. So we have a kind of a history of multiple interpretations, shall we say. Thank you very much. Shall I stay here for 15 seconds? Okay.
So thank you for this interesting presentation. I'm sure you have many questions. I would just like to add that in your presentation, you asked what about the Southeast,
Northeast,
Europe?
But let's call it the Northeast Asiatic.
Okay, so I know for sure that women's organizations in Yugoslavia were very much part of this international law. Yeah. For example, when in 1937 a special some kind of survey was made by countries, what is the position of women in each country. Women's organizations in Yugoslavia were included. Right. So they basically wrote the answers for Yugoslavia, and a Ministry for Internal Affairs gathered those and sent it to Geneva, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I would also like to point out that the abolition is very much, I would say, abolition movement very much connected with the gender, because we now know that even Habsburg Empire was basically to some point involved in slave trade in Mediterranean Sea, especially the Austrian Lloyd, and there the gender was a very important question because women prevailed among
the anti-slavery movement, you mean?
No, and the slavery.
And trafficking.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. That's a good point.
Now, please, the floor is yours. you are invited to ask questions.
I do feel like I've been talking about up here, and then what you're going to do is here, and then how you connect the two. I find really interesting. I think it's a really important thing to connect the two, to see people moving in and out of those spaces, and to put into that history. Because I didn't find it very hard to do it in the Austrian case, to put into that history, the one I'm interested in, which is the international, the engagement of Austrians, men and women. You just look for it and it's there. If you don't look for it, you don't see it. But if you do look, it's there. And as you say, there are those studies. But I'm pretty sure that the Commission on the Status of Women, I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't Yugoslav women somehow involved in that commission. Or at least networks. It's the networks that bring them there. At least, and in the early stages before, and also because once Yugoslavia breaks. So there's the kind of interesting thing of pre-common form and post on what the relationship between Yugoslav women and the UN was in that context.
Please.
Thank you very much. What I wanted to ask was, you mentioned socialist states and their intersections with socialist states, but what would happen if we moved on to look at socialist movements, particularly in Western Europe, and the extent to which the changes that you've highlighted are a reaction to feared competition from revolutionary socialist movements from 1848 onwards, in the aftermath of the First World War, even in the aftermath of the Second World War, where we have, for instance, big communist parties in France and Italy.
Yeah. So there's a big project in England coming out of Exeter on global socialism, and I don't know how much of this they've done, but I know some of the people working there. So, Ljubica Spaskova, for example, but they tend to look at different periods and not at these specific sorts of questions. But I think what's interesting is, the ILO, the first director of the ILO was Albert Thomas. So he was, a French socialist. Now, being a socialist in different contexts can mean many different things, but there's a way in which, in that early history of the ILO, for example, and within that international system in 1919, you're still getting some, engagement of different parties. It's not, the idea of a liberal international order is just meaningless because we don't know, what does that mean? Because we don't know who's engaging these institutions. And, Russia is involved, the USSR is involved in the UDHR drafting, and the tensions around that, people have written about it, but it's not that they don't agree with the Human Rights Declaration, it's just, actually, they think it's not radical enough, right? So, but those nuances are really important, and some more close work. So someone like Freundlich, Emmy Freundlich, she's a socialist in the Austrian context. She's important in the cooperative movement set up. I mean, Julie might know more about, because it's in the British context as well, the cooperative movement that she's working with. And, those networks are also utilising the platforms that are made available through the League of Nations in the interwar. So she becomes the one woman that that the League invites to the World Economic Forum, because these networks of women are insisting that they need to, and they give them a list, and they go, okay, so you can come. But, there are these, I think it's the networks that are really interesting. So the women from the Northeast Adriatic are going to be linked, regardless of the period and of the politics, I think, because, socialism's not limited to state borders, socialist movements, your point. So those socialist movement networks are the ones that are really important in the context of how we build a bigger picture, a more nuanced picture of what's happening in the international sphere. It's not just a sphere of men, it's not just a sphere of institutions. And there are these people in the networks trying to make them work for local politics. And for women, that's what international institutions always were. They were a way of getting what they could not get at home. You use them, and that's why they were so important, or have been so important. So I think the question is, to what extent could we do really interesting research into not just, a default idea of liberal women engaging these institutions even, but actually these socialist networks, and the women's ones, and how much they're connected by even profession. So in the Commission of the Status of Women in the 1940s, there are a lot of female lawyers, like Dorothy Kenyon, the American one. Does she have a network through international organisations with Yugoslav women. I don't know how many there were, in the legal profession at that time, but those networks I think would be really interesting to uncover. So whatever the history of the Northeast Adriatic is, it's linked with this bigger picture, and because it could be that you might get movements locally that don't get heard, but that's part of the story, right? Are they interested in these fora for getting the rights they want? And the best equivalent might be, for a long time, people wrote about the history of civil rights in America or of Indigenous rights in Australia as national histories, and then they realised actually there's a really interesting international dimension, that we have these networks of across countries of civil rights movements and Indigenous movements or anti-racist movements, and they utilise the UN fora, but even the League of Nations before that. Is there a feminist history like that? And to some extent it's being done. The wonderful woman from the CEU who's working on the WI, the women...
Maybe Zimmerman.
I don't Susan, but her colleague, who's actually Dutch. Huh? Yeah, Francisca de Haan. So she's doing really important work in that respect. And so there might be some of the history of the post-war here is probably caught up in the women's, the Democratic Forum? I've written about this and I just have had a blank. The Women's International Democratic Forum, I think it is. And because it's a really important cross-political movement for a few years, maybe only 1 year, before it becomes attached to just a gets kind of marginalised as a communist movement, even though it's not. But that's one of those fora of networks. So, are Yugoslav women involved in these? How are they trying, and they are, I know they are, but how are they trying to use it for politics back home to shift, or to get attention paid to what's happening, to get money, perhaps, for political movements here, or economic questions, to do with economic questions. My own interest is in the economics at the moment.
Yeah. I would also say that networks are changing.
Right.
For example, I would say that after the war, in the interwar period, women's organizations are much more, I would say, at least it's in Slovenia, connected with Austria and Germany.
Right.
But afterwards, after the Second World War, these social networks change.
Right.
Because there are completely different actors involved in international.
And what difference that makes is really interesting, right? Does that change the kind of political leverage they have, or where they go looking for ways of getting what they want?
Yes. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for that conceptually very rich and very provocative talk. Thank you. I want to ask a little bit more about the categories of women who are actually involved in framing this kind of discourse and framing the actual laws. And what I'm particularly interested in is those women who don't fit this norm and how they tend to be actually at the forefront of the various initiatives. Certainly for the in the immediate post First World War, and then in the second immediate post-Second World War period. So I'm looking at thinking about the category of social motherhood and how those who don't fit the actual norm that is being, is being portrayed here and that's being ingrained here, how they're actually, ironically, paradoxically, in the forefront of, of the activism behind this. So I'm thinking about so many women who I've encountered in my research, and I'm sure that's the case in other people's research, where it's the women who are not actual mothers, who don't fit this norm, who have to negotiate these categories, negotiate their own identity, try to fit in different ways. And I wanted to know if you had, I know you've written about various women who fit into this, who are in this kind of, no man's land, so to speak, or no mother's land, maybe, of identity, and what you can think about them in the longer durée.
I'm always struck by the women who aren't mothers, who still are maternalist in their thinking. In the British context, someone like Helena Swanwick, for example, and I think, wow, it's sort of interesting, yeah. Or even Berta von Suttner, I don't think she had children, did she? Berta von Suttner, and she's also but they're very engaged in that subjectivity, as if it's theirs. But from the other perspective, what do I think about it, though? In the sense that, do I think that it creates a kind of attention?
How much agency do they have? And how do they impose their own subjectivity? Or not? How do they kind of overcompensate?
Yeah, so Myrdal is a really interesting, it depends on when, of course. But, you'd have to say that Myrdal is the woman with the most agency and who finds herself in a powerful position. I mean, she's, acting head of the Human Rights Commission after the drafting and then at UNESCO. But even so, she's both powerful and disempowered in the way that women in those positions often are. She's anti-maternalist because she thinks about women's rights as individuals and that they need to work in order to have that status. She herself never got paid for a job until she got the job at the UN. She always worked for Gunnar, So I always think the intersections between their private lives and their public lives are so interesting. And of course, then there was the whole... She was a mother, but she was not a maternalist in terms of her thinking on women's rights. And she used that forum very much in terms of promoting education and thinking of the welfare state as one where the state takes more responsibility for the children, so therefore women are freer. Because in her own case, her husband refused to do anything. So, the state was the only option. That's how I always think about her thinking on this. So I think that's a really important dimension of that history to put in there, and you probably know more than me about it. And of course, so much feminist historiography tries to untangle that. But in those fora, there are huge fights. The status of the Commission, the Commission on the Status of Women is a fraught space, and it's fraught in relationship to the women who don't believe in it. And to some degree, equality via difference, equality as individuals is partly the split there, but not completely. They're still always negotiating the dominant model to get somewhere. So it's also about your realpolitik view of how you get what you want and how you can test it. It's like now, in that way.
Thank you.
But maybe we'll hear more about it in the next 2 days. I have to say, I'm really looking forward to the program.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I was wondering because, of course, the intersections with human rights and women's rights always being tied to the family, and I couldn't help thinking about how can we, could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on where migration is located there? Because I'm just thinking of Jacqueline Baba's work that to this day, and migration, of course, now is a global issue, that women are in a way eclipsed there as well, or are they tied there to the family as well? So where can we bring in migration in addition to maybe family and work and labor and human rights and the gender issue?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can take that question in lots of different directions. I heard a paper recently about family reunion as a principle of migration. I thought that was interesting. I hadn't thought about it. So that's coming out of that, the UNDHR, the rights of the family. And you could argue it comes out of a conservative idea of what a state's responsibility might be towards refugees. But I actually think, it depends on when you're talking about. In the present context, it's extraordinary that there seems to be no principled basis to anything. So now is a much more complex question. Historically, again, I think it's an area of interesting investigation. Unless some of you who have worked on migration have a thought about it, worth thinking about. I don't have an answer.
Glenda, thank you very much for this very interesting, rich and inspirative talk. I find very important this longue durée perspective. And also at the beginning of my reflection about our project, I thought that is important, this long durée perspective, and also I reflected about the post-Napoleonic era. But then I was stopped by my younger colleagues because I find this idea about the comparative research about post-Napoleonic and post-wars in 20th century too strong for us. But I think that the post-Napoleonic post-war produce a path for other post-war period. I don't know if you agree with me, but I think that this For European history, the post-war, post-Napoleonic period is very important to form a political framework to resolve a lot of peace problems.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. But I'm completely convinced by the early 19th century as a key moment and a useful one for comparing actually the present, because it was so shaping of the last 200 years. But in fact, we're moving further and further away, it seems to me, from a lot of the principles of the post-war, as complicated and paradoxical as they often were, but the basic ones about multilateralism, for example. And then, you know, what happens to gender and all that. You know, one of the problems I'm having at the moment with this period is that I both see it as the kind of origins of a really crucial way of thinking about the importance of multilateralism, and as a moment where gender gets completely embedded in that multilateralism, a gender view of politics and political culture, because it's the intersection of the rise of political culture of a modern kind, and it's occurring in the context of these negotiations. And, you know, not just because sometimes negotiations embed laws, other times they're contexts in which people get to know each other and exchange ideas and information. And that post-war order, it's like the moment where you do get a kind of a European imaginary, not just about multilateralism, but about normative gendered states and about what the role of women should be in those states, and to some extent, you know, what the space of Jews should be and slavery and all the rest of it, but actually also women. And you can see it not in the debates, but actually in the kind of exchanges on a personal level where, you know, Metternich might be writing to the Duchess of Sluga or whatever and saying, you don't do politics. You've got a much more, we know, you know, in the Habsburg context, there's a much more fluid world of agency. It's still hard for women to be like men, but it's more fluid if you're aristocratic. And then that kind of, the new norms that are taking shape, and they're embedded in that moment. So I completely agree with you. I'm sorry you're not doing the post-Napoleonic period.
So is there another question, please?
Get more discussion later.
Yeah.
Thank you for your feedback too. It's really interesting. I hope we can continue the discussion through the next year, because I really want to think about your papers and whether they speak to any of this. And if they don't, then I have to think more about the intersections of the social and the political, I think. So I think I'm finished, and now it's time for everybody else, right? Yeah. What time are we supposed to finish?
45.
Oh, okay.
Maybe another question about the relationship between feminism and anti-racism. We know that this question about racism became very important due to obvious reasons after the Second World War. And I'm interested in the question how this correlates with women's fight, feminist fight, and so on, if you have some opinion about it.
So it depends where you look, but I have been struck by the extent to which, in the context of the UDHR, the declaration and the debates, not amongst the drafters but around them, for example, there's a notion that I think is quite strong already at the end of the First World War, that, you know, to some extent, that women's rights is in competition with the rights given to the colonised men. And there's still a hint of that in the post-Second World War. And so in the French context, Cassin writes with one of the few French women who ends up in the UN delegation for the French, and she's a former resistance fighter, I think. And she ends up also in the Commission for the Status of Women. And her argument with Cassin, and he ends up agreeing, is they can't bring the French colonies into this debate. You know, that the French have to have control of what kind of rights colonial subjects get in that context. So we have the examples of what happens at a direct policy level, or debates about policy, and then you have the broader, you know, the move in the post-war to actually articulate an anti-racism statement. And there UNESCO is critical, and UNESCO does that just before Alva Medal comes in, and she has to deal with a lot of the pushback. And that is all dealt with in the realm of anthropology. And the anthropologists at that time, even though there are people like Margaret Mead around, it's a man's world. I've never seen any kind of engagement of feminists with the statement on race. But in terms of anti-racism, there are a lot of examples in the kind of 1944-45 period of women's groups arguing not to be left behind. It can't only be about race, because race is so much on the political agenda after the war that feminists feel they have to fight for their place on the agenda, and that might mean shifting race off it, actually. So they're in tension and competition. It's kind of interesting. Probably not in every context, but there's a lot of that I've seen in the British context. I don't know if Julie has other impressions of this, but I'm trying to think whether it's just the British, Italian to some extent, but probably, again, the WDIF, Francesca's group, might have a different position on this. And I'm thinking of some of the women in the WDIF, even an Australian woman called Jessie Street, they're very clear on their engagement of rights for colonised Indigenous subjects and women at the same time. But so you have these things going on together. Pushback against race because it's instead of women. At the UNESCO, Gillian Huxley says that. We don't have time for women because we're going to have to do with race. And then Alva Medal comes in and says, actually, we can do both. But there is this fundamental problem about, is there space for both agendas in the post-war? I keep thinking, where's the Northeast Adriatic? Every time I open my mouth, where's the Northeast Adriatic? I don't know.
I would like to ask you a question. You are talking about women's rights. Don't you think that human rights are universal, indivisible? In which way somehow you reinforce the rights of the humanity, the women's part of humanity, by, let's say, insisting on women's rights? Isn't somehow the more modern or more somehow powerful to recall all the time the human rights?
What should we do? And Elizabeth said, if you do women's rights, then what happens to human rights? And as Elizabeth said, the problem is men think human rights is only for men. So there's a long history of droit de l'homme, which the French think is the origins of human rights. It's droit de l'homme. And women always have to fight to be included in them.
Droit humain.
But it's not what they use. Droit de l'homme is what they use. So this is the problem. It's not my argument. The historian is to understand that these debates were important at the time precisely because one side felt the human didn't automatically include women, and the other side felt that if you said women, then you were asking for something special and actually had to be human. So, as an historian, I'm interested in why each side might have articulated that and what the implications were. When the Commission for the Status of Women started, in fact, you could argue that because it had a separate body, they weren't very effective because the men all said, well, that's the Commission for the Status of Women, we'll just ignore them. The women worked hard, but nobody took any notice. And this was always Eleanor Roosevelt's point. If you want rights for women, you have to do it within the human framework. But, other people said, but if you didn't pay attention to women, they didn't get rights. They remained women and children, or they remained separate. They didn't have the right to equal pay, because the human was this ungendered, unraced subject. So the problem is not my problem, it's the historical problem. And it might still be a problem now, I think probably in the discourse. And you have to pick your position. But I'm not advocating for either in this moment. But I'm trying to explain the historical context in which that was a debate. I hope that makes it clearer. Yeah. But I get your point. I think it's, that's the point. Yeah. Which side you come out on. Yeah, Andrea. You can have I feel now that I'm down in the audience. I like it down here. There's no lines. It's much better.
Hope so. Thank you very much. This was always quite interesting. And the previous questions sort of prompted me to think about whether during your research you came across the issues of anti-Semitism, in particular in the interwar period. Because from what I understand, in the Yugoslav, especially socialist and communist movement, during the 20s and 30s, it was quite incredible how even feminists and women that were involved in women's movement regarded Jews in their respective countries or respective communities as a sort of major opponents of obviously socialism or communism. So, and usually also regarded in a very anti-Semitic way as a sort of proponents, obviously, of capitalism and so on and so on. So I wonder if there is anything that you came across in this research of international.
Well, I mean, it is the period of minority rights, which is really about Jewish rights. But so they didn't think of Jews as agents of communism or socialism. They thought of them as the opponents of it?
Yeah.
Okay, because then probably we find that Jews lose out in everybody's discourse. Mm-hmm. Because the liberals are probably saying that there's just a general anti-Semitism, and you say they're either the agents of liberalism or they're neoliberalism, probably, our version of it, and or of socialism and communism. But I think that's a really important context. The question would be how much of that then carries over into the post-Second World War, I guess, and whether it's a new generation of feminists that are engaging these ideas of gender norms and family in the context of human rights, and whether they think human rights are also for Jews. No, really.
So thank you. We can have one more question and then we will finish this round.
Was there anyone before me?
No.
Okay. When I was thinking about your speech, I was somehow I couldn't hear the religious part of it.
Religious?
Yes, because humanitarianism is, I think, origins of humanitarianism stem from religious institutions. And I think also, especially religions stemming from Christian fundament, so let's say Catholic Church and all the religious branches of Protestantism are quite patriarchal. So, but also at some extent also in Jewish religion there is a similar pattern, maybe not that rigid, but also. So I wonder if you came across any findings in regarding to the religion and humanitarianism, since the temporal scope you dealt with is heavily connected to religion, and religion is a moral authority of that area.
Absolutely.
A great part.
That's a terrific question. So that's absolutely true. And so if you go back to 1814, it's clear that not just the kind of bourgeois agents who are kind of increasingly engaging in international politics and ideas of national independence for other people, like this very wealthy Swiss Genevan couple, they do it in the context of Christian humanity. And the idea of this anti-slave trade movement comes out of Christian, the Quaker movement and the Christian movement in Britain. So, and also if you think about the UDHR, there's a big argument that this is based on a Christian idea of family and but you also realise that what's interesting about the international domain, even though you have these clashes between Kassan's Jewish and the Lebanese Christian Malik, and you have kind of a Catholic framing, Jacques Maritain's influence on this period in the UDHR, the 1940s. You can always, I think, draw out the significance of the Christian context, and then Protestant versus Catholic, And then where's the Jewish figure in this? And, the French secularism, the French Jew who's actually supporting French secularism. But what is fascinating is fundamentally the levels of agreement. So I'm trying to understand what's the spectrum of thinking. In 1919, in that room where the women come in and say, can we have women's self-determination, right? Previously, there was a debate in 1919 about race equality. And in that debate, there were differences. There was a majority for race equality being part of the League of Nations Covenant. The exceptions were Australia and the United States. And that was enough for Wilson to say no race equality. But there was some difference of opinion. There was no difference of opinion between the Maharaja of Bikaner, the Japanese or the Chinese or the Italian or the British or the American. Nobody disagreed on the fact that you cannot give women rights in the international domain. You cannot, because that is the right of the nation to distinguish how they're going to give those rights and what kind of status they have. So there's a universal acceptance of the possibility of difference, depending on your religion, for example, where you're going to fit women in the family. But they accept that the right of sway over the family and over women is the right of the nation. And if the nation has different religious positions on this, that's fine. And that same kind of thinking, I think, comes into the UDHR. So what's so fascinating, and I have colleagues who are experts on the human rights declarations, and they all agree. What's so fascinating is, the debates between Catholics and Muslims, but actually a level of agreement, right? So family, then you have the interpretations of it. And then you have the rejection of more radical readings of family as well. So, perfect question, and really one where that granular historical reading gives you a lot of, a sense of the spectrum and where it stops, where there's foundational agreement. And that's such an interesting space to discover, where women agree with it too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, hvala.